Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at the story from chapter 38 from the Road to Latin textbook called De Horatio II. Now this is a continuation of chapter 37, right? The story of Horatius at the bridge. So it should sound kind of familiar, and even though the vocab won't be exactly the same, it does kind of continue the same story, so you see the same characters, a lot of similar vocab, so it's not too bad to work your way through this, okay? Now before we dive too far into it, like I always tell you, if you want to see the chapter or the story in another way, feel free to go to Nova Latin. You can find everything there from grammar notes to vocab to Quizlets, practice problems, a bunch of stuff that'll kind of help you out. So feel free to take a look and just expand a little bit of what you're doing. Okay. Now, before we dive too far into the actual story, there's a few things we want to cover. One will be the grammar, which I'll get to in a second. But before that, I want to just give you some tips that I always say in these videos. The first thing you want to do before you dive in is you've got to learn the vocab, right? It's almost impossible to understand what's going on with any Latin if you don't know what the words mean. And even though it is very similar to chapter 37, there still will be some new words thrown at you here. So you want to start by memorizing them, practice on a Quizlet or a Gimkit, whatever it is that you use, and just make sure that you know them really well. The other thing you want to do is read the story aloud, right? So find a classmate, read the story to them, have them read it back to you. That way you're working on your speaking and your pronunciation, right, when you speak, as well as your listening, when you're listening to them read it back to you. Those are always great skills. You never want to just read and translate in your head. Bring the language to life, right? Let it be what it was always meant to be. You don't want to just do it sort of in your own mind, speak it, work on it. You never want to shut those parts of your brain off. It might unlock the language for you, right? You never know what type of learner you are until you try all the different ways. So you want to treat it sort of like a modern language in that way. And you definitely can do it, right? Particularly if you have a classmate to help you out. So once you've done that, the other thing that I always recommend you do is use the read and reread method. So once you feel like you're in a good place, read through the story once and write down any problem areas you have as you go through it, right? So it might be vocab, it might be grammar, whatever it is, make a list, read through the entire chapter story, then come back and look at your list. If you had a problem with vocab, that's really easy. Just look the words up, right? Memorize them, you'll be okay. If it was grammar, try to figure out where you went wrong. It might be from this chapter's grammar, right? So you want to pre-read or work your way through some of the grammar before you read the story, just so you have a sense of what's going on. Like I always tell you in the Road to Latin text, the grammar is always in the story, right? So you learn it through context. So it's not a bad idea to get a jump start before you read through it. But if you read and your list has grammar on it, just go back. It's probably from this chapter's grammar that's got you stuck, but try to see where you went wrong and fix those mistakes. Then you read through the story again, right? And on the second time, you should have fewer mistakes than on the first. And you keep repeating this process until you're able to read all the way through the story without needing any help from vocab, without having to look up any grammar, anything like that. If you can read through it and understand the vast majority, if not all of the story, that's how you know you're in a really good place and you're ready to move on. Okay, if you're still having problems, you want to go back and just keep doing that read and reread method. That's how you get really good at a language. And it really kind of sinks in, particularly the grammar, the vocab as well, but it'll really sink in a lot better way when you're doing that, as opposed to just reading through it once, looking at a translation and moving on. Okay, so if you haven't done that yet, learning the vocab, reading it, read and reread, write the grammar, all that stuff, pause the video and go do it. But if you feel like you're in a good place, I'm going to start by doing a quick overview of the grammar just to get you in the right place, and then we'll read through the story together. Okay, so like I said, here's the grammar, and just a fast overview because it kind of piggybacks on chapter 37, which was about degrees of adjectives. Now, in this chapter, we're going to kind of expand that a little bit and look at irregular adjectives. But before we get there, we said that the degrees of adjectives, right, are just different forms of the adjective. So the positive degree is the basic form, good, bad, happy, sad, right, the ones you know. The comparative degree is when you are comparing something, right, comparing the quality of one thing to another. So you get good becomes better, bad becomes worse, happy becomes happier, and sad becomes sadder. And then the superlative degree is the highest degree when you're talking about the quality of something. So in other words, good becomes better, which becomes best as a superlative. Bad goes to worst as a superlative. You have happy, happier, happiest, and then sad, sadder, saddest. So best, worst, happiest, saddest. Those are what we call the superlative, right? The highest sort of degree of that adjective. Now, there are others, though, that you want to keep in mind as we work our way through. But this is the general form of how we're doing it with regular adjectives, right? We kind of reviewed this last chapter, but you're looking for that IOR in the comparative, the isthmus in the superlative. But you can do this with irregular adjectives too, right? But like the name implies, you're not going to follow the same pattern because they're irregular. Okay, so don't get too thrown off by this. If you're wondering, like, what's an irregular adjective? We do this in English, right? If English is your first language, you'll be used to this. So good, better, best is an example of an irregular adjective in English, because good and better don't look anything alike, and best doesn't look anything like good, right? That's why we call it irregular. That's what we're looking at in this chapter. So once you kind of get a sense of what they are, they're really not too bad to figure out. But because they're irregular, the best way to do this, there's not a ton of them. It's just to learn through practice and memorization. And I'd always recommend that you read and get practice, right? Practice problems to memorize. Don't just memorize them. I mean, you can if you like memorizing charts, but I think a better way to do it is through context, right? Of reading stories and looking at practice problems or sentences anyway. So this is what they look like, the irregular adjectives, okay? So you have good, bad, big, small, much, and many, right? These are the first we're going to look at. And the positive degree are things that you've seen before, words like bonus, malus, magnus, parvus, multus, multi, right? These are probably things that you've seen. Where it gets weird is in the comparative and the superlative. So bonus, good, becomes melior, which means better, and becomes optimus, which means best in the superlative, right? So just like with English, good, better, best, not really looking the same. Same thing in Latin. Bonus, melior, and optimus are three different words. And you notice that the superlative doesn't have the isthmus ending that we're used to, which makes it kind of weird. The comparative does have the IOR and the IUS, which makes it a little easier to spot. But the reason it's irregular is it's not spelled anything like bonus, right? You'd be expecting something like bonior, which you don't get, or bonissimus, which isn't a thing. So that's why these are irregular. And the same thing happens with malus, bad, right? It becomes peor, which looks completely different, and pessimus, which means worst, right? And you can kind of see that there's some similarities in English. So if you call someone a pessimist or an optimist, you can see where they come from. They're related to these adjectives, right? So the others that you want to look at are these. So you have, and this is what the Road to Latin textbook points out. You have low, inferos, outside, exter or exteros, and high, which is superos, okay? Now, these are also irregular, right? And you can tell by their comparative and superlative. So inferus becomes inferior, which looks kind of close, right? That makes sense. But the superlative is infimus. So that doesn't really look like what you'd expect. Same thing with exter becoming extremus with exterior in the middle. So these are just three more that you can think of that the book likes to use for these irregular adjectives. Like I said, it's not anything you need to necessarily go nuts over. It's just about practice. And once you practice them through reading or practice problems, things like that, you'll start to recognize them faster. Even if you don't necessarily recognize, maybe the case, you could at least start to see, words like superior and be like, oh, got it. It comes from superior, superus, which means high. So superior means higher. Oh, got it. And these are things that will kind of help you out, little tricks to help you through. Okay. The other part of the grammar that you want to look at is the ablative of degree of difference. So this has to do with comparisons. So we can use the ablative case with comparatives, right? When you're doing a comparison, in order to indicate how much something is in the comparison. So what do we mean by that? Well, you could say Julius est molestior quam Gaius, and it means Julius is more annoying than Gaius. Got it. But what if you have two different people who are annoying, right? Maybe you have Julius is more annoying than Gaius, but you want to know like how much. Is he more annoying than, say, Julia is to Secunda or whoever you want to put in there? So that more or much more is what we call the ablative of degree of difference. You're giving a little degree to it. So in other words, when I put molto there, it's not just that Julius is more annoying. He's much more annoying, right? So you're kind of giving a level to it. Okay, that isn't there before. The same goes with Paulo, which means little. So if I said Julius est Paulo molestior quam Gaius, I'm saying Julius is a little more annoying than Gaius, right? It's like, they're almost the same level of annoying, but this person is a little more than that. That's different than Julius is much more annoying than Gaius. Right now, I'm really separating the two. That's all you're doing here. And you use the ablative to do that with molto and Paulo, which are in the ablative case. Now, the reason I gave two of these is you're seeing the exact same thing written with the ablative and with quam, right? So molestior quam Gaius is the same thing as molestior Gaio, right? We've seen that, in chapter 37 when we talk about comparisons. That's all you're looking at here. But don't get thrown off when you start to see with comparisons in this chapter the words molto and Paulo. That's just the ablative of degree of difference. Okay, so it's kind of a technical jargony name for something that's really not that bad to understand in English. Okay, so if you want more on this, feel free to look through the actual chapter, read through the notes. I recommend you do. My website has everything there. If you want to watch some videos on it, feel free. But one way or another, you want to look at this grammar before you dive into the story, like I said, just so you can see it in context, which is what we're going to do now. Okay, so if you haven't done all that, pause and go back. Otherwise, work your way through the story right now and just see if it makes sense to you and your translation was close to mine. Okay, so our story starts like this. It's continuing with Horatius. So you have Horatius Cocles, cum aliis militibus Romanis pontem defendebat. Okay, so you're saying Horatius Cocles, remember that's the famous hero we're talking about. He was defending the pontem, the bridge, that's the Pons Sublicius, right? The woodpile bridge, the only way to get across the riverbanks, right, of the Tiber River. So he was defending the bridge with other Roman soldiers, aliis militibus Romanis, right, with other Roman soldiers. Then you have subito copias porcenae infimum ad montem decorrentes viderunt. Okay, so suddenly they saw, meaning the Romans saw, right? It's the copias, rather, the copias porcena. So copias are the troops. So they saw the troops of Porcena. Remember, this is Lars Porcena, the Etruscan king who was attacking. They saw the troops of Lars Porcena, decorrentes, right, running down to the infimum ad montem, right, to the bottom of the hill, infimum montem. So they're going to the bottom of the hill. They're charging down, right, towards them. You have etaque magno terrore commoti alii in aliam partem fugieban. So, right, commoti, having been moved by magno terrore, by great terror, the rest of them, alii, right, so the rest of the Romans, they fugieban, they fled in aliam partem, they fled into another part, meaning they ran back into the city. And alii, you could even translate some, right, so not all of them leave, but a lot of them leave, right? Then you have tum Horatius clamavit, quade causa Romani fugitis. Okay, so then Horatius, he shouted, right? Quade causa means for what reason? So he says, for what reason, Romani? That's just vocative, so Romans, are you fleeing? Do you flee? So he says, why are you running away? Timetis ne mortem. So he says, do you fear? Timetis, right? The any just means you're asking a yes or no question. He says, do you fear death? Mortem. And that's meant to be a little bit of like a jab or an insult because, in this time, a true Roman soldier would not fear death. Death is the idea. So he's like, what, are you afraid of dying? Then he says, copiae etruscorum sunt magnae, sunt multis milibus militum maiores quam nostrae copiae, sed virtus Romana est maxima et semper omnia vincet. Right, so he has this long line. He says the troops of the Etruscans, right, the copiae etruscorum, right, so the Etruscan troops, they are great, magnae, right, they are great, and he says they are maiores, they are greater than. So here's your comparison. Right. So what are they greater than? They are greater by, and it's not just that they're greater than something. You have the comparison happening here. So they're greater by many thousands of soldiers, right? Multis milibus militum. There's the degree, right? By many thousands of soldiers, they are greater than nostrae copiae, than our troops. So it's not only are their numbers great, but they're greater than us by many thousands. But said the virtus Romana, Roman virtue, is maxima, is greater, is the greatest, you might even say. So the Roman virtue is the greatest and always vincet, always will conquer, omnia, everything, all. So he says, don't worry about it. He says, there's many thousands more of them than us, but we have Roman virtue, right? And that word virtus is really a comment on sort of manliness and inner strength is sort of the idea. Okay, so we're starting the story with this. Horatius is at the bridge, right? Lars Porcena, if you remember from last chapter, they're on their way and they're defending the bridge. A lot of the Romans are getting scared at this point and they're running away, but Horatius stands his ground. Okay, then you have similites mali Porcenae pontem tenuerent, cives Romanos in servitutem dabunt. Okay, so he says, if the soldiers of evil Porcena, right, the milites mali Porcenae. So if the soldiers of evil Porcena, they will have, tenuerent is future perfect, if they will have held, meaning like taking control of the pontem, the bridge. So if in the future they will have held the bridge, taking control of the bridge, right? They will put dabunt. They will give. You might even say they will give cives Romanos, Roman citizens, into slavery, in servitutem. So here he's using the future perfect to say something that hasn't happened yet, but might happen. Is kind of what the if is doing here. So he says, if this will have happened, they will put us in slavery, into slavery, right? So he's saying this is what's going to happen if we don't hold this bridge. Then he asks, esne mors servitute peor? So he says, is death, mors, right? Is death, peor. Here we have the irregular, right? So this means worse. So he's saying, is death worse than slavery, right? Servitute, right? So he's making that comparison using the ablative, servitute. So he says, is death worse than slavery? Right? Civibus Romanis vero servitus rather, est longe pessimum malum. Okay, so you start with the dative to a Roman citizen or to Roman citizens, truly, right? Slavery, servitus, is by far, longe, right? Here's sort of that other sort of comparison here. So by far, the pessimum malum, the worst evil. So he's saying, for a true Roman citizen, we would rather die than be slaves, is kind of the idea. Okay, so that's kind of the vein he's tapping into to inspire his men. And he says, Romani nunquam servi erat. The Romans never will be servi, never will be slaves. So he says, we're never going to be enslaved, and that's what they're going to do to us, so we're going to fight to the death. Okay? And he says, hic minimus pons solus, conjuges liberos nostros defende. So he says this small little bridge, right? Minimus pons, right? So this little bridge alone, solus, right? So this least of the bridges, this littlest bridge alone defends, right? It defends our wives and our children, right? Conjuges liberos nostros. So our wives and our children. So again, now he's tapping into the idea of your family, protecting your family. He says this bridge is the only thing defending that. None nos igitor hoc ponte etruscos prohibebimus. So he says, surely, right? This is when you're asking a yes or no question, but you already know the answer, right? You're expecting the yes. He says, surely, therefore, we prohibebimus, we will prevent or prohibit, right? Surely we will prohibit the enemy, right? We will prevent the Etruscans from this bridge. So he says, surely we will prohibit or prevent, meaning don't let them by the Etruscans from the bridge, meaning we're not going to let them cross. So he's like, we're going to do that, right? And again, notice how he uses none, which means he's expecting a yes answer, because what person wouldn't want to defend their family? Then we continue, and you have same idea, another none question. So he says, none nostras conjuges liberosque ab hostibus liberabimus. So he says, surely we will free liberabimus, right? Our wives, nostras conjuges, and our children, liberos, from the enemy, ab hostibus. So he says, surely we're going to protect them, right? You're not going to leave them to die, and surely we'll protect our wives and children. And then he says, "Cifero ignique pontem vos delebitus, ego solus in extremo ponte stans, hostes prohibebo." So he says, if vos, you all, I mean, he's talking to the rest of the Romans, he says, if you all will delete or destroy, delebitus, if you all will destroy the pontem, the bridge, with ferro, with iron, and with igni, with fire, right? So he says, if you will destroy it with iron and fire, I alone, right? Ego solus, I by myself, standing, stans, there's our present participle, right? The ns ending is unique to a nominative singular present participle. Standing in extremo ponte, right? Standing on the end of the bridge, meaning like sort of the other side of the bridge. I will prevent, prohibebo, I will kind of ward off or fight off, prevent the hostes, the enemy. So he says, here's what we're going to do. I'll stand by myself and take on the enemy. You go destroy the bridge behind me. This is what Horatius is famous for, this sort of act of selflessness where he defends the bridge by himself, where you're going to see he's not quite by himself, while the rest of the Romans destroy it behind him. And in that way, they'll kind of keep the city safe. Then you have acerrimai copiae etruscorum hunc pontem non tenebunt. Okay? So he calls the copiae, right, the troops of the Etruscans, etruscorum. So he calls them acerrimai, right, the fiercest. So he says the fiercest troops of the Etruscans will not hold, non tenebunt, they will not hold hunc pontem, right, this bridge. So he says, don't worry about it, I've got it, they're not going to take over this bridge. This is why he's a famous hero, right, for deciding to kind of one-man stand against an entire army. Okay, then you have haec dixit et extremum ad pontem cucurit. So he said this, dixit haec, he said these things, right? And he ran to the far end, the extremum, the far end of the bridge, right? Extremum pontem. So he runs to that other side of the bridge. Then you have Herminius et Lartius, duo milites optimi ad Horatium properaverunt. So Herminius and Lartius, they're described as two of the best soldiers, optimi milites, right? Two of the best Roman soldiers. They hastened to Horatius, right? So they properaverunt, they hastened or hustled to Horatius, so they're not going to leave him there. So it's really the three men in the story of Horatius at the bridge. You have hitres erant multo audaciores cunctis etruscis et eos a ponte prohibebant. So these three, these three men, they were audaciores, they were more bold, or they were bolder. It's a comparison. Here we have multo. Again, this is that ablative of degree, right? So they're not just bolder, they were much more bolder than cunctis etruscis, than all the Etruscans. And they prohibebant, they were preventing them or prohibiting them, eos, right, them, from the bridge. They were keeping them from the bridge. So they're much more bold, meaning they're kind of zealously fighting better than any of the Etruscans, and they're holding them off, right? Just 3 men, which kind of makes sense because a bridge isn't that wide, so 3 men probably could do this, right, as long as you don't get killed. Then you have Ceteri Romani maximo cum studio pontem deleban. So the rest of the Romans, Ceteri Romani, the other Romans, so the rest of them, they were destroying the pontem, the bridge, right, deleban. They were destroying the bridge with the greatest studio, zeal, right? It almost means like haste here, but eagerness, right? Their zeal. They're really working fast to destroy the bridge, okay? Then you have Mox Horatius Herminio et Lartio Clamavit, pontem reliquite, right? Reliquite, mei comites. So he says, so then soon Horatius shouted to Herminius and to Lartius, the 2 men with him. When he says relinquite, it means leave behind, right? Leave the pontem, the bridge. Mei comites, my friends, right? My comrades. So he shouts to the 2 other men and he says, abandon it, right? Relinquite, he says, leave it behind, right? Save yourselves is kind of what he's saying. So here's really where Horatius stands alone in his bravery. He tells the other 2 men to leave. Then he continues and he says, ad ceteros Romanos properate. And again, these are imperatives, or he's commanding them. So he says, hustle or hasten to the rest of the Romans, meaning on the other side of the bridge. So he says, leave the bridge behind and go that way. Ego solus in ponte manebo. I will remain, manebo, right? I will remain on the bridge solus, alone. So he says, I alone will remain on the bridge. So he tells the other men to save their lives. Then you have Horatium reliquerat et ad terram infirmam cucurerat. So they, right, those men, the 2 of them, they left behind reliquerat, right? They left behind Horatius, and they cucurerat, they ran to the terram firmam, to firm land, right? To solid land, meaning on the other side of the bridge. Okay, so they run away, right? But not cowardly, right? He tells them to, but they run. Okay? Then you have tum hostes clamantes tela in Horatiam miseron, sed Horatius rupis similimus scuto tela eorum accipieba. So then the enemies the shouting enemies, hostes clamantes, they sent tela, weapons, right? Which really means like javelins, stuff you throw, right? They sent weapons into Horatius, meaning they're probably shooting arrows at him and throwing spears and all these things. But Horatius, and he's described as similimus, right? So here we have that superlative. So very similar to is really what it means, or most similar to a rupee, to a rock. So in other words, he's kind of standing there like a rock on the end of the bridge. So very similar to a rock. He accipieba, he received tela eorum, right? The weapons of them, or their weapons, with his shield, scuto. Now, when it says he receives them, it means he's blocking them, right? We've seen that phrasing before, where he's kind of blocking their weapons with his shield, and they can't get to him. Tandem pons magno fragore and flumen cacedit. So finally, the bridge, with a great crash, a magno fragore, right? With a great crash, it fell, cacedit, in flumen, into the river, meaning the Romans finally destroyed it. Then you have Horatius, deum fluminis invocans impeditus in flumen desiluit et ad terram tutus venet. Okay? So Horatius, right, impeditus, right, so unhindered. Horatius, he invoking, or it's a present participle, invocon. So invoking the deum fluminis, the god of the river, right, the Tiber River. So invoking the god of the river, he jumped down, right, desiluit, into the river in Flumen, and he came safely. So venet tutus, right, tutus is the safe and sound, safely. He came safely to the terram, to the land. So he says a quick prayer, right, to the river god. He jumps out, right, the bridge is gone, so he jumps into the river, and he makes it to the other side alive and sort of safe and sound, right, which is the miracle of it all. Then we end with this last paragraph. You have sic Horatius magnum et bonum factum eget. Nullus miles umquam erat Horatio maior, nullus miles umquam erat Horatio melior. So thus Horatius, he did a factum bonum et magnum. He did a great and good deed, right? This miracle, this famous deed. You have nullus miles, so no soldier ever was maior Horatio, was greater than Horatius, right? There's you're using the ablative in a comparison, right? So greater than Horatius. No soldier was ever melior, better than Horatius. Those are the irregular degrees of adjectives there, right? Melior, better, and maior, greater. So no soldier was ever better than him. Etiam hodie homines fabulam de maxima et optima virtute Horati narrant. So even today, etiam hodie, men narrant, they tell fabulum. They tell the story about the maxima et optima virtute Horati. They tell the story about the greatest and best virtue, virtute, of Horatius, right? Because he was such a famous hero. So even today, we tell stories about Horatius at the bridge. Okay, so hopefully that made some sense.